Strengthen your understanding of governance and policy design. The 12-week graduate course in public policy begins 10th January 2026. Apply by 30th November 2025 to avail a 10% early bird scholarship.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I am Bhumika Sevkani, a research analyst with the Indo-Pacific Studies program at the Takshashila Institution. Today, we will talk about the future directions in China's energy transition, wherein we explore which technologies are likely to see an increase in deployment and the factors that will affect their development. Two key documents recently released by China are the 2035 Nationally Determined Contributions, the NDC targets, and recommendations of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China for formulating the 15th five-year plan. Now, to gain more insights on these documents, we have with us today Belinda Schäpe. Belinda is a China policy analyst with the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, where she analyzes China's decarbonization journey and advises policymakers on their diplomatic engagement with China. Welcome, Belinda. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Bhumika. So happy to be here.
Right. So, Belinda, before we begin discussing the numbers and trends and figures and all of those briefly, could you just take us through on why do you think it is important for us to look into these trends for climate policy and renewable energy in China?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me personally, there are so many reasons, right? But I think when we start from the emissions point of view, it's just quite obvious because China is the biggest emitter, contributing a third of global emissions. And it's also contributed 75% of emissions growth over the last decade. So it's really, provided a chunk of the problem. It also hosts the largest coal power fleet, but it's also seen a tremendous change in the last couple of years where we're seeing this emissions growth finally leveling off, and that's thanks to renewables. So China not only hosts the largest coal power fleet, it also hosts the largest renewables power fleet. And it's really kind of built the supply chains around that as well. So it's become the top global clean tech producer, not only producing for its own expansion of renewables, but also for countries around the world. So in many ways, it's kind of like the superpower when it comes to the problems of climate change, but also the solutions. And I think that's why it's so interesting to kind of get into the nitty-gritty things of what is driving this change in China and what can we expect from the future.
Absolutely, Belinda. So this whole saga about China becoming the manufacturing powerhouse for renewable energy equipment is something that is a really interesting story, and I think which is why it's also important to look into renewable energy trends going ahead in China. So looking into the first document that I mentioned, the 2035 NDC targets, which were submitted by China in about November, they mentioned that the country will increase its non-fossil energy supply to 30% of total energy consumption by 2035. But I understand that this is just a headline figure, right? So could you help us flesh out some details pertaining to sectoral targets and also sort of tie this document up with the recommendations for the 15th five-year plan and throw some light on what technologies are likely to see more investments in the coming 5 years?
Yeah, certainly. So these nationally determined contributions were submitted by China as part of the update that all countries have to do as part of the climate negotiations. So it's like an international pledge, an international commitment. And it was quite unique because it was the first time that China set absolute emission reduction targets that were sector-wide and covered all greenhouse gases. And the top headline target was to cut emissions by 7 to 10% by 2035 compared to a peak, and striving to do better. And that was the first time we saw these absolute targets. So that's really great. And it was announced at the highest level by President Xi Jinping personally. But unfortunately, as it stands for now, those targets are not quite aligned with the Paris Agreement just yet. So what we actually would need to see is at least 30% emission reductions by 2035 compared to current levels. So you see that headline, the numbers don't quite add up, but also the peak level is quite a challenge because with an undefined peak, it leaves space for for different actors to want to grow emissions as much as they can before the peak. So it's easier to come back down afterwards.
Right.
So it's kind of creating like a dynamic of storming the peak domestically. And then rightly, as you mentioned, there are a few sectoral targets. So one of them is the 30% of total energy consumption should come from non-fossil fuel energy. That should be at least 40% according to our analysis. That would be aligned with the Paris Agreement. So we're also quite a bit off there. But the other one is the target for renewables build out for solar and wind capacity to reach 3,600 gigawatts by 2035. That may sound like a lot to many countries, but because China, everything is like China scale, right? It would actually mean a slowdown, a dramatic slowdown of the build out that we have seen in the last couple of years. So it would mean around 200 gigawatts of solar and wind added every year over the next decade on average, compared to 350 that we saw last year, and likely closer to 400 that we're going to see this year. So you can see there's a bit of a mismatch. But we are quite confident that China is going to be able to overachieve these targets because we are seeing that emissions are already starting to level off. And we are seeing a renewables trend that is going much ahead of government targets. That's been the trend over the last 5 years. China achieved the targets for 2030 6 years early. So we also expect that to happen with the NDC. And we've also done a survey with Chinese experts, and 2/3 of them also are quite confident that China is either going to significantly or partly overachieve these targets. And in terms of what technologies are going to play a key role in this, I would say solar and wind are crucial in terms of electrifying the power system. For them to continue like a steady build out, but also supported by grid infrastructure, by storage. This is something where the 15th five-year plan recommendations have kind of focused on, not just on like building out and maintaining the speed of renewables, like just adding, but also really building a comprehensive system that works, that is supported by these like other infrastructure elements, and also supported by policy reform to the power market that makes it more flexible and reactive in a way that works better for a renewable power system. But I would say there's also still quite a lot of hurdles along the way, particularly when it comes to heavy industry, where a lot of the reduction in emissions will actually come from reductions in output. But there's still a bit that is still reliant on technological advances, and especially making these more financially viable. And the biggest hurdle, I think, is still like coal in the power sector and coal in industrial sectors, and how to find a way to transition away from that in a way that's meaningful for provinces, that doesn't undermine the economic development, and that incentivizes cleaner production and cleaner of both of industrial products, but also of the power system.
Right. So it is interesting to note on how the solar and wind deployment target that you mentioned is actually quite less from what they've been, what China has been deploying in the previous years, right? So, but again, as you mentioned, solar, wind, EVs, and all of these are key solutions within China for meeting the overall emissions reduction commitment, which kind of underscores the central role these technologies play in the country's overall development as well. But continuing from this question of technologies, so what do you think the R&D ecosystem for clean tech sectors looks like in China? And so I recently also read about this, wherein wind turbine manufacturers in China have been leading in new product introductions. So is that a trend that can be seen across different renewable energy technologies, or could you just help us look into those trends as well?
Yes, I think it's very much linked to China's overall economic development plan. Because the idea is to transition away from heavy industry and from the real estate sector as the main growth drivers of economic growth and towards high-tech manufacturing. This is kind of what's been the priority in the previous 5-year plan, and what's going to be another priority in the 15th 5-year plan, to kind of focus on this high-tech manufacturing, on science and technology, and clean technologies are like a crucial part of this. I would say it's not something that just came overnight. It's something that has quite a long-term run in China. So we saw already in the early 2000s, there were policies that were kind of looking at, high-tech manufacturing and also clean tech manufacturing. But then in 2020, when China announced its carbon neutrality target and its target to achieve peak emissions before 2030, we really saw it kick off. So a lot of the provincial governments tried to implement this policy and then compete for the best companies to produce in their locations. We've seen quite a growth in the idea of net zero industry parks to kind of bundle these industries and really create integrated supply chains, where you see a lot of learning effects between different sectors or between different parts of the supply chain of different technologies. And then, of course, we also see competing companies, right? Really trying to create the best products at the cheapest price and bringing down prices. I think one of the most prominent examples is perhaps in batteries, where we really see a competition between CATL and BYD that are both bringing new batteries onto the market that are longer range, cheaper, faster, and better. And this is kind of the development that we're seeing. And I think in a way it's unique to China because you have that economy of scale and you really have a close interlinkage between industrial policy and climate policy. But I don't think it's necessarily something that other countries can't learn from or can't replicate, because I think having that long-term thinking and kind of linking these different interests together and making it really implementable is quite crucial. So I think the system as it is built is really conducive to bringing about new innovation. So that's what we've been seeing across these sectors, and then scaling once a technology has been good enough to kind of reach broader markets. So, for example, when it comes to solar panels, the innovation there has been a lot less. But they're just good as products as they are, and they're really cheap. So they have a huge market both in China and outside of China.
Right. Thank you, Belinda, for that. So, as you mentioned, that in some of these sectors, we've seen on how China goes from innovating and then to exporting, and then so scaling and then exporting, but then to overcapacity as well, real quick. So, for some of the examples that you mentioned, like batteries, I think innovating in the product is the only way, I think, for a company to distinguish and then sort of grab a larger market share, only because of the scale of competition that they see in China, right? But again, so while we are aware of the exports of renewable energy components as key drivers in China, but then could you also throw some light on what role has renewable energy played in contributing to China's GDP, but then even more so on how does it contribute to China's energy independence? So the policy directors have been focused on developing export-oriented industries, even when it comes to renewable energy equipments and components. But do you think that is going to change going ahead? Is there going to be more efforts on sort of stimulating domestic demand, or is it going to be focused on export markets as well?
Yeah, I think these are really good questions. For the first one on the economic dimension of clean technologies, my colleagues do an annual analysis trying to assess exactly that, how much clean technologies contribute to the economy. And the next one is coming out early next year. So for all the listeners, do watch out. But for 2024, which is the most recent one that we did, China's clean energy sectors contributed 10% to the GDP. And that's really huge, right? That's nearly $2 trillion US. And without those, China would have missed its headline GDP targets. it wouldn't have grown by 5%, but it would have grown more like 3.6%, something like that. And what's interesting is that these sectors are also very dynamic. So they are growing on average 3 times faster than the overall economy. So we're seeing a lot of growth there, nearly, a quarter of GDP growth coming from clean energy sectors now. And for the first time in 2024, they overtook real estate sectors in sales value. So they're really starting to bring about that change that I mentioned earlier and becoming major economic drivers. And our estimate is that over the next decade, China has the opportunity to double the value of these sectors to around $4 trillion US. And that would be huge, right? It would contribute a significant share of the GDP growth that the government is targeting by 2035. But to kind of come to the question of energy dependence, I think it's crucial from that aspect as well, right? Because China is very dependent on fossil fuel imports. It has a lot of resources of coal capacity, but it's dependent on oil and gas imports, and it's been trying to lower that dependence. And of course, clean technology rollout has played a crucial role in that. And also maintaining control over the supply chains has played a very important role in that. So I think going forward, as China is going to peak oil consumption, perhaps as early as next year, due to the decarbonization we're seeing in the transport sector, and then also going to peak coal consumption within the next 5 years, we're definitely going to see quite a shift there. And in terms of what that means for Chinese clean tech exports, I think it's interesting to, remember you already hinted at this dual circulation strategy that China has of becoming less dependent on others and making others more dependent on China. Which from a selfish point of view makes sense, right? But of course, other countries may have concerns about that strategy because they also don't want to be dependent. I think for now, China is still the largest market of renewable technologies. So the domestic build out will have to continue, like at least a similar scale of what we're seeing at the moment. It won't really be able to offset that just through exports. And it very much depends by sector as well. For example, in solar, it's relatively even. China exports almost as much as it installs domestically, but for wind, it's much, much less. So I think, longer term or even shorter term, like in the next 5 years, it will be really crucial for China to keep up this momentum of domestic deployment if it doesn't want to accumulate more trade tensions with other countries. I think there's a lot to gain for other countries from importing these cheap and good clean technologies, but many also want to build up their own industries. So we kind of see that tension there. And this is something that Chinese manufacturers will have to grapple with in the next couple of years as well.
Right. So a few interesting points there, right? So in terms of, I think you also mentioned earlier in this podcast where the 15th five-year plan is also focusing on building the supporting infrastructure, the grids, and connecting the larger projects to the grids. So I think that is one area where they could sort of reduce their dependence, that could contribute to reducing their dependence on fossil imports. And then there are also new technologies like that they're sort of deploying really at a really great speed, which is the hydrogen, clean hydrogen technology. Yes. And as you mentioned, right, the transport sector, I think the deployment of fuel cell vehicles, fuel cell EVs has also been great in China. So I think that's going to be an interesting development to watch out for going ahead. But yes, so coming to the second aspect of your answer, where the countries face this sort of dilemma of importing cheap equipments from China or allowing their own sort of domestic industries to flourish. So this was also one of the aspects that I wanted to touch upon, is that this renewable energy trade also plays an important role in China's climate diplomacy, right? So if you could also touch upon other aspects of China's climate diplomacy and, of course, how do green technologies feature in it? But we know that BRI has played a prominent role in building renewable energy projects overseas. And now we also see that there is an uptake of overseas investments led by private enterprises, by new energy equipment manufacturers. They're going out and taking up EPC contracts for building these projects. So how do you think that host countries are receiving these investments by the equipment manufacturers? Is there greater scrutiny from the receiving countries, similar to the imports in this domain, or is there a greater imposition of conditionalities, or are they readily accepting these investments? What is it like?
Yeah, certainly. First, on your question around climate diplomacy, I think traditionally China has always kind of portrayed itself as a leader of the global south. This is how it wants to show itself. And this is very much as negotiating positions within the climate negotiations as well. I think that hasn't changed so much, even though China's role in the world probably has changed dramatically. And its contribution to emissions also has changed, since it's now the second largest historic emitter. So not only in current terms, but also when we look back historically. So I think there is increasing pressure for China to take on more responsibility, both in terms of stepping up its domestic ambition, but also in terms of its international influence and providing climate finance to countries in the global south, and especially vulnerable countries that are impacted by climate change. So this has become an increasing point of focus, I would say. But at this year's COP30, it was quite interesting because neither of these played a very big role. China was in a very good position, I think, with the US having withdrawn from the climate negotiations, that it could step in and say, look, we uphold this multilateral framework. We're still committed to climate change and we'll aim to do our best. And by the way, we're also the biggest contributor or producer of clean technologies, basically enabling the global energy transition. So it didn't have to do much more to gain praise from other countries. That was quite a comfortable position this year. And I think it also kind of framed, like it was a bit of a defensive strategy, coming in on these climate finance questions. It's kind of saying, we're already exporting cheap, clean technologies. We're also investing into manufacturing overseas. So this is kind of part of our contribution to this. But I do think in the next couple of years, we will come back to these questions, and we will come back to both China's role domestically and China's role internationally. But yeah, on your second point around the BRI, certainly, I think we've seen a huge change or shift of the BRI, the way that it's framed. Many companies and officials burned their fingers in the first few years of the BRI. There were a lot of challenges. There was very little oversight. So there was a lot of backlash around environmental impacts, community impacts, lack of consultation, all of these things. Yeah. So now the shift for the new second BRI 2.0 is kind of small and beautiful projects. So to de-risk some of these, make them smaller scale, make them, more better monitored, perhaps. So while on the one hand, we've seen more than half of Chinese coal finance being shelved overseas since 2021, since China kind of withdrew its support for overseas coal finance, the renewables uptake had been rather slow because it was small projects. So they didn't really replace the previous huge coal projects that were there. And we're still waiting for this to actually pick up more and to kind of replace these projects that also have been cancelled. But we have seen a lot of momentum, especially as you were saying, around overseas manufacturing. 220 billion, I think, of US dollars is how much China invested in 2 years into clean tech manufacturing overseas, according to one study by Johns Hopkins. So that's really impressive. That's a huge scale. And it kind of, in a way, also counters the critics, right, that don't want to be dependent on Chinese exports, but it also helps other countries to build that manufacturing capacity. But I do think in general, I think Chinese actors both companies and state actors could become a bit more proactive in project development of renewables as well. So we've seen some of that happening as part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, where President Xi announced that they would support the members with 10 gigawatts of wind and 10 gigawatts of solar in the next 10 years. That's very good. It's quite small, but it's good that it's becoming more proactive. And I think this is something that I hope we will see more of in the coming years, both in terms of, development of new projects, but also developing of manufacturing capacity.
Yes, I think that's another trend that we could watch out for, right? The increase in the small and beautiful projects, but then also this investments in manufacturing by the Chinese equipment manufacturers. Right. So there's this one last aspect that I wanted to touch upon, Belinda, is that I saw that you had worked on recommendations for cooperation between EU and China in renewable energy. So could you briefly take us through those recommendations? And also, can you tell us if a similar approach can be taken up by other countries looking to work with China in renewable energy?
Yeah, I think much of this is also applicable to other countries. I think, of course, it depends on the unique economic structure of each country. For the EU and China, a lot of the tensions arise now because China is starting to compete in manufacturing areas where the EU has a stronghold. So that's making it really difficult for European manufacturers to maintain their standing because Chinese companies are so competitive. So this may not be the same challenge for other countries, but it may also be a similar challenge if they're starting to build out those. So I think I have 5 points that I would recommend for the EU and China to work together in advancing the green transition, despite the geopolitical tensions that we're seeing. So kind of like in this context. The first one, and I mentioned this earlier, is really the question about long-term strategic policy direction. This is so crucial in building up lead markets for clean technologies. And this is something China has done very well domestically, but something that the EU hasn't been able to foster as much yet. And we've seen recent rollbacks as well of EU green policies that created a lot of uncertainties rather than incentives for industries to really flourish in these sectors. So this is the first one. Then the second one, I think there are a lot of real trade tensions on these questions, and there are no easy answers to any of them. But I think that's why it's so crucial to really engage proactively in these discussions and have a very candid diplomatic exchange on these across all levels, both on the technical level, but also on political levels, to really work through some of these issues, but at the same time also build a global vision of the benefits of green technologies, how they can contribute to the economies, and kind of really create that vision that this is the path forward. Because we do see a lot of backlash in certain parts of the world that want to go back to a fossil fuel era that others want to leave behind. So that's quite crucial. Then I think the third one, at the same time, I think it's important to also diversify supply chains. Like during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that it's highly unsustainable for one product to come from one country. And for countries to be reliant on that, right? So I think diversification is in everyone's interest. This can be done through, for example, implementing some kind of percentage-based import limitations. Say only 50% of this strategic good can come from one single country. These kind of things, I think, could be implemented. That's both relevant for Europe, but also for other countries around the world. And it would then incentivize investments into manufacturing capacity elsewhere. And that leads me to the fourth point, which is kind of, building these diversified supply chains together with other partners. I think there's a lot to be said for investing overseas in helping other emerging countries to build up these clean tech manufacturing sectors. India has seen a lot of momentum around that. We have seen that as well in Indonesia and Vietnam and other parts of the world. China is investing a lot, as we said, but I think Europe could also, benefit from engaging with these countries and supporting their economic development, which would then translate into more resilient, diversified supply chains. And the last one is more, Europe related, but I think it's also about trying to attract investment from Chinese companies, from those that are already leading in the field, to gain technology transfer in the sectors where Chinese companies have made so much advancement, but doing that in a way that really benefits local communities and local economies, and where there is a very clear framework on how to do that in a way that everyone's kind of happy with. And I think this, in the end, it also applies to other countries, right? Anyone receiving Chinese investment may want to have a very clear framework on how to go about this. Not just because it's investment from China, but because it's investment from another country, right? So I think those are the kind of like 5 elements that could be helpful in going forward. I'm sure there are many more, but I'll limit it to those.
Yeah, of course. These recommendations, I think, are very helpful, Belinda, on sort of pushing countries to find points of convergences and engage with China in technologies where it has a competitive advantage. So thank you, Belinda, for those insights and these recommendations. So that's about it for questions from my side today. Your insights have been really interesting and offer our listeners a sort of future directions to look into, a lot of future directions actually to look into. And yes, thank you. I hope you enjoy. I really enjoyed this conversation. It was a delight hosting you, and I hope our listeners also enjoy this conversation.
Thanks so much for having me, Bhumika. I really enjoyed our conversation as well.
Right. Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.